When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Scum YouTube channel. Today's video, we are going to be covering a question that I was asked on stream, and it was about, could Robert have defeated Dany if he was still alive when she came over? Now, this is a difficult question to actually answer because there's two ways you could look at it. One way is kind of what I've already talked about before, is let's say in this scenario that Drogo doesn't die and Drogo and Dany come over. The other scenario that I want to talk a little bit more about in today's video is if Robert had actually lived all the way through the main story up until Dany has Meereen, and she is then going to come over with presumably like the Dothraki, the Unsullied, and her dragons. So there's going to be two different scenarios. We'll talk about the first one first. The first one is, I think, much more difficult to figure out because I don't think anyone in Westeros would go to Dany's side initially, because you're bringing over Dothraki, you're bringing over Unsullied, all things that Westeros have prejudiced against. And so when you also think about the point of, okay, would marrying Dany or would going to Dany's cause gain you anything? And if you're thinking about some of the houses that are not as tied into Robert as of right now, you would be looking at like the Tyrells. The Tyrells at this point don't see any reason for them to join Dany. Dany would be married to Drogo. There would be no real reason as to marrying to them. Also, in this scenario, I would assume Viserys is still dead, right? We're just kind of picking up after the plot line and then just acting like Drogo doesn't die in the later part of Dany's story in a Game of Thrones. So that's part of it. The other part of it would be, would the Dornish come to Dany's side? And again, this is very questionable because you have to think about the Dornish from the point of view of like, do they think Dany can win? And also, how do they feel about these foreign armies coming over as well? And so for me, it's like, yes, you do want fire and blood if you're Duran, but at the same time, I don't know if this is the way you would want it. I think the Dornish actually would just stay out of the war. I don't really think they would get involved with it. I think they would be isolated and just not do anything. With that being said, I think when you look at a war between Drogo and Westeros, I think Robert is right in a lot of different ways. Like, you don't want to meet Drogo on the open battlefield, but I think the thing that would separate Westeros from the Dothraki... Okay, actually, let me retrack on something. Not the Unsullied, right? In this scenario, the first scenario, it's just the Dothraki. So if it was just the Dothraki and Daenerys, not the Unsullied, not other armies she gets later, I want to make that very clear. So the Dothraki come over. I already think, right, the Dothraki will have less numbers in this battle. They will have less equipment in this battle or this war that's going to play out. They are not going to know Westeros that well, and there's not going to be really anyone to actually help them with that. The best person they're going to have is going to be Jorah. He is basically going to take a major leadership role when it comes to telling them where everything is. The Dothraki are completely new to this area. So, let's say, in this scenario, they come over. The Dothraki will also have to worry about how provisioned are they, right? How much food do they have? And so what I think would have inevitably end up playing out is at the beginning of the war, it would start going really well for the Dothraki. They would be able to take out a lot of the villages, a lot of the towns surrounding major castles. So kind of what Tywin's strategy was in the Riverlands and what he had Gregor doing would be similar to what Drogo would be doing. But the reason I do not think that Drogo and Dany would be successful is that, again, I think if you're a smart lord, and you have a lot of smart lords, you have Tywin, you have Ned, you have Robert, you have Stannis, you have all these people that understand warfare. All you'd have to do is you bring in all the harvests from all these places into castles, and Drogo's army would eventually crumble. They wouldn't be able to sustain themselves off of the land. They would slowly probably kill themselves off, get weaker. Their horses would start to die. And so it would almost be a battle of morales. Kind of similar to what we look at with like World War I, where it seems like you're at a stalemate. But I think as the war goes on, as the war goes on and it goes on, I think eventually it would turn in Robert's side. I think eventually his forces would be in a position of better strength, better morale. Again, they're fighting for their country. The Dothraki are just fighting to invade, right? The Dothraki would lose morale quicker if they saw themselves losing than Westeros would, right? Because they're defending themselves from an invader, right? That's a uniting force. Think about a lot of times when anyone invades Russia, right? You have that idea that they are trying to destroy your home. Think about Tyrion's speech at King's Landing during the Battle of the Blackwater. It's all that motivating factor is home, right? They're trying to take your home, take your women, steal from you, and break down your homes. That's going to apply here. And so I think in the first outcome, it would end up in Dany and Drogo's defeat. I don't think they would have had enough military leadership. I don't think they would have had enough supplies. I don't think a lot of things would have gone well for them. That's not even really talking about, there's no way they could have even attempted to invade the North. They did not have the clothing or even military strategy to be able to do so. I think the more that they spread themselves thin, the easier it would be to kill them. So they would have to stay all together. So again, very difficult. Now, you could also make the argument that, hey, you have a lot of mounted Dothraki. They can perform a lot of campaigns similar to what Robb Stark does in the West. And even when you come into the Riverlands as well, when he comes south, that's possible. But again, I think Robb is a much better military tactician than Drogo, in my opinion. Drogo's a much better fighter, but Robb has a better military mind when it comes to actual strategy. And so I think in this first scenario, I believe that our Westerosi forces would win. The second scenario is quite interesting, because if Dany comes over with fully grown dragons, if she comes over with more forces, right, because she'll have more forces. We assume that in Winds of Winter, she's going to get a lot of the Dothraki. She's going to have the Unsullied. She's going to have some sellsword companies. It's possible in this scenario as well that Illyrio still tries to get Young Griff and the Golden Company to marry her as well. And so all this happens. And the other thing, the other part of it is Young Griff would not go to Westeros. Westeros in this scenario is not going to be torn apart, right? They're still going to be united under Robert Baratheon. So it actually does make a lot of sense for Illyrio to marry Young Griff to Dany, if that is even possible. Now, let's just say that maybe that doesn't go right, but maybe it goes right at the same time. Regardless, the Golden Company are going to be with Dany, right? You have a lot of forces now at this point, right? You have a very formidable force with Westerosi leadership and all of that. And again, the other part of that with Young Griff is Tyrion is not going to be there to convince him, because that only happens because Robert's not king and all the trickle effects that happens. In this scenario, if Robert's still on the throne, we have a somewhat peaceful and unified Westeros. So Dany comes over, and again, we still have to question, do the Tyrells jump to the Targaryen side? And you have to think, what do they gain out of it, right? Like, again, in this scenario, if Dany is married to Young Griff, or even if Dany doesn't want to remarry, the Tyrells can't get on the throne. So that is a pretty big factor. In this scenario, if, for instance, Dorne wants to go over, would they do so? And I think Dorne is much more likely in this scenario to go to Dany's camp than the first one, because Young Griff is going to be posing as the child of Elia. So there is that connection, as well as the Daenerys forces have a better chance of winning, in my opinion. And so I think the Dornish get pulled into the war this time instead of just sitting out of it, because that's going to allow them to maybe pull Tyrell forces, to pull Stormland forces to try and deal with that threat. Now, everywhere else would be mainly the same. It would still be pretty loyal, but I think one kingdom diverting some of that, you know, influence and power over to them, as well as Dany having more forces that would be able to show her how to lead, would be very important. And so Barristan, again, would also not be here because he'd still be with Robert Baratheon. So you would still have, it's very difficult to track the timeline because things change based upon Robert still being in power. But Daenerys coming over with the dragons, I think would win, right? I think her with the dragons, they would beat down Robert. I think her armies would be pretty much able to roll through a lot of Westeros. Not to say that it wouldn't be a hard fought war, because there's still a lot of great military leadership, but I do think Dany would win in a scenario in which she has the power she has at the end of Dance. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.